Why don't cattle producers employ more biosecurity measures on their operations? What will it take to get you to change? Deborah Murphy here, and those were just two questions that Franklin Gary, professor at Colorado State University, asked delegates at the UCVM Beef Cattle Conference in June. For many of us, biosecurity is a bit of a scary subject, but it doesn't have to mean hazmat suits and saying no to hosting the upcoming family reunion, though it can work as a legitimate excuse. After his presentation, I caught up with Franklin Gary to talk about scours. You might have already heard that interview. If not, check it out on our website. And, of course, biosecurity.
I blend two slightly different concepts when I talk about biosecurity, and I tend to phrase it as biosecurity and hygiene management. True biosecurity, as most people would understand it, are things that prevent a disease from entering a herd. And those are very, very powerful. If you don't have a disease in a herd, you would really rather keep it out. That works for certain diseases and not so well for others. So, for example, that works well for Johne's disease if you don't have it in the herd. That's how we avoid foot and mouth disease. Those are true biosecurity practices, how you protect the herd from contact with the pathogen. The second concept is what you call biocontainment, where you have the infection in the herd, and the idea is to prevent it from spreading from animals that have it to animals that don't. But in the end, those things blend together because conceptually, it's that series of things that prevents both introduction and spread. And so I tend to use the term biosecurity fairly broadly and also then incorporate all those hygienic or management practices that minimize spread given that the disease is there. Why? Because there are a whole bunch of diseases we work with that you can't really prevent from entering the operation because they're, as we say, ubiquitous, meaning you can't find a ranch that doesn't have some of them. Good examples of that would be calf scours or the respiratory pathogens, and those are pretty much native to the animals. And so if you're going to have cattle, you're going to have crypto, you're going to have rotavirus, you're going to have coronavirus, and it would be really difficult to set a strategy that prevents it from entering. So when we blend those together, then we're looking at thoughtfully looking at a strategy that says, here are the diseases that are important to me that have an impact or could have an impact on my herd. How will I either avoid it entering and or avoid it spreading if it did enter? And that's where you focus your efforts on management.
Mm-hmm. So you asked the question, why aren't producers putting more of an emphasis on biosecurity, basically, and what would it take for them to change? And do you know what? I tweeted that out, and I got a response, money and more money. How would you respond to that?
Oh, I think that's sad. I would have actually answered differently. I would say the reason most people don't do that is because as humans, all of us, veterinarians, producers, and the public at large are humans, and we look for the easiest pathways to do certain things. So if there's the sense that there's a pretty simple one-step thing that we can do, that's what we're going to choose. So I call that the solution in the bottle. So a heck of a lot easier to find the disease and treat it because you got an answer. Unfortunately, it's very, very costly. It's the most costly way to manage disease. Alternatively, people will say, oh, well, we vaccinate, which again actually costs a fair amount of money and is less effective if you don't match it with other management that prevents disease spread. You can take almost any disease and vaccinate for it, but if you have overwhelming presence of the pathogen in the farm, the vaccine will only be effective to a very marginal degree. If you match the vaccine with really good management, you minimize it. So relative to the answer that you got tweeted back, which is not that terribly different than mine. It's just attributing it to a slightly different cause. People will justify why they don't do something based on whether it's cost or, I already do some of that, or, geez, that's a lot of work, or whatever that reason is. I think is because they haven't carefully sat down and thought about it. Most of the biosecurity practices are not particularly costly. The net impact is always better. It's always more cost effective to prevent a disease than to deal with it once it's there. So maybe there are some costs up front with some of these things, but the long-term return is good. And if you reduce losses, then you increase profitability. So my example to producers, which is very straightforward, is if one of your major herd infectious disease problems is, say, scours, for every calf you lose, Every individual calf you lose, you have to increase weaning weight in the next 10 calves by, say, 50 pounds just to make up the difference in the potential gross revenue that you would have received. Well, that's pretty compelling. So, yeah, for some of the procedures you might choose to implement, they'll have a cost. The good news about employing a strategy is that you can think through which ones do I want to use. And you can decide, that one's too costly, this one is not. And there's a lot of options of ways to improve what you're doing, so choose the ones that are the most effective for the least cost with the best return on investment.
Do you think it's also a bit of a scary word when we hear biosecurity? We think shower in, shower out.
Yeah, that would be another good reason. I hadn't thought about that one, but that rings true. There's been so much focus on biosecurity as a word that we use when we're talking about really intensive livestock operations, things like poultry or swine, or specific pathogen-free places, or preventing the introduction of some foreign animal disease, that it has an overtone of like seriousness and problems and inconvenience that probably are an impediment. But the truth is, if you actually sit down and look at all of the things that are contained in maintaining better hygiene, better management, better animal movement, pre-selecting animals, thinking about who you're going to purchase, investigating whether that animal is more or less likely to introduce the disease in the herd, those things really aren't all that terribly messy. They're typically fairly logical, and they're not nearly as overwhelming as maybe the superficial impression would be.
So what are you hoping that producers leave here, go home and do?
I have one specific aim, which is to actually connect veterinarians with producers. I find it tragic that, on the one hand, if I talk with a producer, they will tend to suggest that, well, my veterinarian, he doesn't talk with me about that, or I'm not even sure he really knows about that, or, he's never spoken to me about it. And on the other hand, if I talk with a veterinarian, then they're going to tell me pretty confidently, the problem is the producers don't want to pay me for that. The producers don't want my time. They're actually not looking for that. They're looking for something else. So we have this communication breakdown that is very tragic, because the truth is, like any other potential knowledgeable consultant, the veterinarian has stuff to offer that the producer could certainly use. Not necessarily that they're going to implement everything that an individual veterinarian says, but that you have a discussion going on so you can choose options. You can choose the thing that works for a place. But if you don't get that conversation going, then it's easy for one side or the other to have a reason why that conversation doesn't take place. So if I can have obliged, when I talk with veterinarians, I try and get them obliged to, you need to talk with your producers. If I talk with producers, then I tend to be, you need to talk with your veterinarian. My suggestion is, if you even spend just a half hour with a veterinarian talking about what potential things are worth discussing, thinking about, looking at, it'll be a half hour well spent. And then from there, people might find that, there are some things I could do to really improve my operation and ultimately my profitability. So that's my goal. Get producers and veterinarians talking about things that really help in the long run that they tend to find it convenient to avoid in the short term.